and my life is like a lamp to a world that is searching for the path. We have become the example of Christ, and we are now the light of the world. Can the world see the radiance of Christ in you?
Evangelism does not happen by accident. Discipleship does not happen by accident. If we're going to fulfill our God-given mission as a church, we need to be intentional and reach out and share and introduce people to Jesus Christ.
Africa is an amazing continent with 50% of its population under the age of 18. If we impact the children, we would have impacted the future of the church and the future of our world.
Each one of us has something to bring to the table. Are you willing to release your resources? Surrendering your material goods or your gifts and talents or your time or your heart? What are you going to do?
If we're going to plant the 300 churches, if we're going to reach out to 1 million people through evangelism, if we're going to disciple 100,000 in this nation, and if we are going to have an impact with the poor, with the needy, with children, with all the others who are part of our communities around us, it's not going to happen unless you have committed yourself to the purposes of God and you have been faithful to live by those purposes. The second principle was last week, where we said that without a vision, the people perish. That's the way that the King James puts that verse in Proverbs. Without a vision, the people perish. And it's the same when it comes to our finances. If you don't have a dream and a vision for your finances, if you don't know what to do with it, if you don't have a goal to put your finances to, you will not create wealth. If you don't have a vision, you go nowhere. And that's principle number 2. Today, we go to principle number 3. So if you turn in your Bible with me to the book of Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14, I want to read verse 28 to verse 30. Okay? I'm reading from, I believe this is the Living Translation, or rather the Living Bible. It puts it in very easy language, but I like the way it says it, and so follow with me in your Bible. It says this. Luke chapter 14, verse 28. Is there anyone here who, planning to build a new house, doesn't first sit down and figure the cost so you'll know if you can complete it? If you lay a foundation and then run out of money, you're going to look pretty foolish, and everyone passing by will poke fun at you and say, he started something he couldn't finish. In other words, in simple, easy language, the Bible is saying to us, what Jesus was saying was this: budget and plan, calculate your cash flow, and make sure you have enough funds to complete what you start. Otherwise, you'll end up being the laughing stock. In other words, if you have a project, you must plan your cash flow, your outflow versus your income, because before you begin, you must have a budget. To the young men here, you don't get married if you can't afford a wife. And wives are expensive. But to the young ladies also, you do not get married if you can't afford a husband, because husbands are even more expensive than wives. Keeping a husband is very expensive. You don't get kids if you can't afford to care for them. And a child is a 25-year investment of outflow and outflow and outflow and school fees and doctors and pediatricians and hospitals and food and rent. There's an outflow and you probably will not get a return in terms of inflow. My own daughter, one of my daughters, when she was younger, we taught her how to handle money. And she was, very good at counting every shilling, knowing exactly how much she has. And once or twice, I'd go to her and borrow some money from her because she had money. And she lent me 200 bob one day. And then the next day, she came for her 200 bob. And I said, hey, Bwana, I feed you, I clothe you, I school you, and you're coming to stress me about 200 shillings. And she said, Dad, this is my money. I want my money back. When you're old, I will now bless you. 25 years of outflow with probably no return. You don't take a mortgage unless you're sure you can repay. Banks love people who can't repay their loan. And you don't want to be one of those. Don't make financial commitments unless you're sure of what it will cost you and that you can pay it back. Balancing your outflow against your income, making financial projections and repayments. This, my dear friends, is what we call a budget. You might not like the term budget or budgeting, but the Bible tells you to budget, to plan, to think ahead, to prepare, and do not start a project if you don't know whether you have enough to finish it. So principle number 3 can be stated this way from that passage in the book of Luke, okay? Principle number 3, people who budget are the ones who create wealth. Or put it another way, your budget is your vehicle to wealth. What does a budget do? A budget tells your money what to do for you. You see, money is a servant. That's all money is. Money is your servant. Every shilling is your servant. Some servants run around to provide food for you. Some servants run around and provide a place for you to sleep. Some servants provide, wealth by being invested. But many times, with what God is putting in our hands, we are the middle class. With what God puts in our hands, sometimes you have servants who don't have a job description. And when you have money that doesn't have a job, what tends to happen is the master of the servants eats his servants. And if you get into the habit of eating your servants, you are squarely on the road, on the highway that leads to poverty. You will not create wealth. Budgeting is simply telling your money what you want it to do for you. If you don't give each shilling a clear job description, then eventually it gets eaten up by junk and by stuff which puts you on the road to poverty. So how does a budget work? I'm going to be very clear, very simple. I'll even share with you, what we do. Some of you here are young, you're just in your first job. Nobody has ever taught you how to use money. Nobody has ever told you how money works. Some of you are older, you've learned the hard way, so much of what I say you already have learned. But there are many who just don't understand. So I want to be very, very clear and very simple today, okay? How does a budget work? Okay, let's begin here. Let's imagine Steve goes, first job ever, and there's a company that is willing to hire Steve for a gross salary of 100,000 shillings. Okay? That's a lot of money. And I want to use 100,000 because it's easy. We're working with percentages, so I won't get lost, and my figures will be sort of correct. And so even though you may not earn 100,000, it's an easy figure for me to use. So I'm going to use 100,000. So he earns a gross of 100,000. Steve is very, very happy because he's being paid 100,000. What Steve doesn't understand is that when he gets a gross of 100,000, the taxman comes along, and in this Kenya, if you earn more than 45,000 shillings a month, you are in the top tax bracket, which is 30% of your income goes towards your income tax. So of the 100,000, the taxman comes and takes 30,000. And Steve's salary now drops from 100,000 to 70,000. But that's not the only person who comes and bites off a chunk of Steve's salary. Because there's a guy called NHIF, he comes and takes some. And then NSSF comes and takes some. And then there is a training levy of 2%, and he takes some. And then there is a 5% pension, and he takes some. By the time the line has finished taking, poor Steve, who's earning 100,000, only gets 63 or 64,000, somewhere there. I'm rounding it off to 60,000 because everybody comes and takes his money, and he's left with 60,000. By the way, in this country, we're very highly taxed because when he goes to the supermarket, they take 17%, which is sales tax. And so it drops down even further, okay? But Steve takes home a net of about 70,000, but at the chapel, we have another term we use. The gross figure for many of you doesn't really matter because you never see it, and you'll never see it. It was just to make you happy, okay? The net figure also isn't that important because even that one you'll never see. So we use a different term at the chapel with our staff. We call it the take home. And when we employ somebody, we tell them, your take home, in other words, the money we'll deposit in your account is this amount. After everybody else has taken the money they demand, the statutory returns, deductibles, and the, PAYE, your take home is the money we put into your account. That's what your real salary is, okay? So Steve takes home 60,000. So here's the rule of thumb about budgeting, okay? If you forget everything else, on the basis of Luke 14, remember this one truth. If you're living on more than 60% of your take home, you're living beyond your means. And you are squarely on the road to poverty. If you're living on more than 60% of your take home, you are living beyond your means. What that means for Steve is that what he actually takes home is 60%. And 60% of 60,000, is 60,000. 60% of 60,000 is 36,000 shillings. So even though he gets paid 100,000, if Steve is living on more than 36,000 shillings a month, he is living beyond his means and he is squarely on the road to poverty. You're supposed to say, ha! Because it is a shock, okay? And I want you to calculate your own figure. 60% of your take home. If you're living on more than that, you're on the road to poverty and you're living beyond your means. So how does this work? Let me show you. Of the 60,000 that Steve takes home, the first thing he does is to set aside 10% as a tithe to the Lord. Okay? Principle number 1, God is a giver of wealth. You don't rob the person who is trying to bless you. So give God his tithe so that you can know the blessings of God. Proverbs chapter 3 verse 9 to 10 says, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. So Steve takes 6,000 shillings and he gives that to the Lord's work. Number 2 is he takes 10% of the 60,000 and he puts that into a retirement fund. So another 6,000 shillings goes into retirement. You know why, guys? Because if you start working at 25 years and you eventually retire at 65 years, which is the official government retirement age in this country, 65 years, you work for 40 years. But at 65 years, you have another 20 years of life in you. So for every 2 years that you work, you must put aside 1 year's living expense. Did you catch that? For every 2 years from the age of 25 that you work, you must put aside 1 year's reserve for when you retire. 1 year's reserve for every 2 years. That's steep. And if you don't start at 25, you will not be able to catch up when the years go by. And for those of you who are hoping that NSSF will be enough, NSSF is not a retirement fund. NSSF is the bus fare to take your belongings and good back to the rural area. It's finished after that. It doesn't go further than that. Do not depend on Social Security NSSF. And for those of you who have a pension scheme with your employer, okay, you put aside 5% and your employer puts aside 5%, okay? And then it is given to a pension board to invest for you. And the pension board at the end of the year declares that we were able to grow your investment by 8%. So it looks good. What they don't tell you is that the inflation was 11%. So even though you got 8% growth in your investment, you lost 11% on your investment. You went backwards, not forwards. And so your pension is not going to be enough. Do not depend on that for your retirement. Put aside 10% on top of everything else and invest it yourself, whether it's in land or it is in real estate or it is in a business or it is in shares. Invest it yourself and beat your pension fund's investment if you're going to prepare for your retirement. Now, if you start at the age of 25, okay, first salary, put aside 10%. Every month, put aside 10%. You will not need to worry about your retirement. But if you don't, it will catch up with you. You're not too young to start preparing for what will take place 40 years down the road. If you're 35 years old today and you have not started doing this, then you need to start putting aside 20% because you've lost so much time. And the compounded interest that would have been yours for the last 10 years. If you are 50 years old and you have not yet started, you need to put aside 50% of your salary now. It grows very steeply if you do not start in time. So that's 10% that goes into the investment, or rather the retirement, okay? 20% of Steve's salary. The third 10% is set aside for investments, okay? This is what you go and put in, in a chama or in a sacco, or you invest in a house, or you begin to purchase your own home. You put 10% aside so that you can invest and you can grow wealth. Okay? That's called your investment amount. So Steve's budget, 60,000. 6,000 has gone into a tithe, 6,000 has gone into a retirement fund, 6,000 has gone into his investments, and then there is a final 10% that goes into an emergency fund and a replacement fund. So 40% of Steve's take-home salary has gone into savings that he's not going to live off, but that will serve him and grow his wealth. What is an emergency fund? This is what an emergency fund is. An emergency fund is a fund you set aside for the day when the roof caves in, for the rainy day, as a shelter for the troubles that come unannounced. When you go to the hospital here in Kenya, you've been in an accident and you go to the emergency ward and they need to admit you, they tell you, we cannot admit you unless you put down a security of 300,000 Kenyan shillings. Or they tell you go to the next hospital, which tells you 200,000, or go to the next hospital. An emergency fund is a fund you depend on when that happens, that you can get admission into hospital. An emergency fund is a fund you depend on when there is an illness that insurance does not cover. An emergency fund is a fund you depend on if you lost your job tomorrow and there is no income, your business collapsed, and there is no salary this month. An emergency fund becomes your fallback plan. And in this Kenya, with our turbulent, economy that is very, non-dependent, you can't depend on it. You need an emergency fund of somewhere between 6 and 12 months. If you lose your job tomorrow, it takes you 6 to 12 months to find another job. What will you eat if you didn't have an emergency fund? If you have children in school, then you should put in at least 2 terms fees so that if you lost your job, they can still continue in the same school as you look for a new job. And if you have a mortgage, then you should put in at least 3 months so that when you lose your job tomorrow, you can go pay your mortgage, run to the bank manager, sit down and renegotiate the balance of payment while you look for a new job. That's what an emergency fund does. An emergency fund is not to be used for your monthly expenses. You don't dip into it to supplement your monthly funds or monthly bills. You don't use it to bail out your friends when they need a cash loan. You don't use it to buy a car. You don't use it for insurance. You don't use it for normal medical bills. It is for an emergency. Nothing else. So how do you build up an emergency fund? Let me give you some ideas, because it's not easy to do this. You begin by putting 10% of your salary aside into an account that is an emergency fund account. And then you start a side hustle. You bake and sell cakes, or you produce honey. Anyone here who lives on more than a quarter acre of land should have bees to produce honey. They are the best workers you can ever have. They never take a sick leave. They never ask for a public holiday. They never go, they never take annual leave. They work for you day after day after day. And you know what's even better? They go to your neighbors and they get their honey and the nectar and the pollen and bring it to you and create wealth for you. And so you can keep hives and sell off the honey. A side hustle. You can start a cottage industry. You can begin to tutor. You can become a consultant on the side. If you're an auditor, then you can do audits for little businesses that can pay you, and you put that amount aside into an emergency fund. Or You put all your coins in a tin. I have a big flower pot at home that is empty with dry flowers, and every time I come into the house, I have coins in my pocket. I throw them into that pot. One day, it's this big. One day when it is full, I will take my pot to the bank, I will pour out all the coins, and I will be surprised by how much money I have saved. What do you do with your 1 shilling coins? They are your servants to create wealth for you. Or you take a 30-day challenge and you say, this month, my 30-day challenge is I'm not going to buy any meals at lunchtime. I'm not going to buy any coffees. I'm not going to buy any sodas. Every time I would have bought, I'm going to put that money aside into my emergency fund. Or you say, this month, I'm not taking my car out. I will take the bus to work, or I will walk, and I will save the money and I will put that aside. You're supposed to walk minimum 10,000 steps a day. That's about 10 kilometers. And so if you live anywhere within 5 kilometers of your job, it's a great thing to walk 5 kilometers to your job and 5 kilometers back in the evening. For many of you, 10,000 is just the start. You have so much weight to lose, you need to do 20. And once your emergency fund is established, then you turn that fund into what I call a replacement fund. In other words, one day your car will die. And when it dies, you don't go for a bank loan. When you buy your first car, you start saving aside the money. Let me give you a couple of hints, okay? Number one, any car you buy, Mitumba, okay, has at least a 15-year lifespan in it. The only reason you would change it before 15 years are over is you're trying to show pedo. And that will lead you to poverty. 15 years. The cheapest car to run is the one you already own. Even though it has issues, it is cheaper than buying another car and trying to run that. So do not replace your car for at least 15 years. Run it for 15, and after 15, you replace it. But you start saving for your next car now. Let's say, for example, I decide the next car I want to buy is going to cost me 4 million shillings, okay? I want a good car the next time. I have 15 years. Every month, if I put aside 20,000 shillings for 15 years, I will go and buy not one car, but two. Because I'll sell the old one for whatever value it has and add that to my car fund. And this money I'm putting aside would have earned interest and compounding interest at that. So it will not be 4 million by the end of that time. It will be somewhere in the range of 7 million. I can go and buy myself a car and buy my wife one. Clean, no loan. No, the only car loan you should ever take is the first car. After that, if you have to take another loan to replace that first car, that's bad stewardship. You did not plan for it. And that's what the replacement fund is for. Your TV has a lifespan of about 16 years. Even though you'll have to be kicking it at the end for it to come on, okay? Remember what we said, do not change your electronics until they die. Then you can go and change them, okay? Your fridge has 10 years. Your mobile phone has at least 6 years before the battery dies out and cannot recharge. Do not replace them. Instead, start putting aside 50 shillings a month, and you will have the money when you need it 6 years down the road to go and buy another mobile phone. So that's your replacement fund. Now, 40% has gone into savings. And now there is a balance of 60%. This is your living expenses, 60%. And this is what you do with your living expenses. I'm going to read a list of things that fall within your living expenses. It pays your rent and your school fees and your fuel and transport and your entertainment and your coffees and restaurant and haircut and perfume and groceries and electricity and water and land rates and land rent and cell phone bills and your watchman or security and your household repairs and your car repairs and your tuition and your credit card bills and your insurance and your gifts and your clothes and your vacation and your newspaper and your junk food and your, gifts to extended family, your house help salary, your medical, your wireless, your birthdays, and everything else. 60%. If you're living on more than 60% of your take-home salary, you're living beyond your means, and you are on the road to poverty. So what do you do? Because that sounds like a tall order. Well, here's what you do. You move into a cheaper house. Go and live in Komorok, or you live in Ayani Estate. You move your children to a cheaper school. You cut back on your shopping. You simplify your menu. You make your own household soap. You can get 20 liters of soap for 500 shillings if you make it yourself. You downsize your lifestyle. You grow your own vegetables in a kitchen garden. You give up your car and use public transport. You start a side hustle so that your 60% is a little bigger. But if you cross the 60% line, you're living beyond your means. So this is what Steve's budget looks like. We'll put up a slide so that you can see. Now, I need you to go home and to calculate what your own budget should look like and how you will tame it and get it to this. If you live beyond your means, it's a horrible way to live because you end up in debt, you end up depressed, anxious, and under a lot of stress. This is where your stress is primarily coming from, because you're not living within your means. So here's what my wife and I do, okay? We not only keep a budget, and we live within that 60%, but we have 7 joint accounts where we both have to co-sign to get money out of the account. The first is what we call our tithe and benevolence account. And when our salaries come in, we put our tithe into an account, and then we give it where we need to, but we put it into a joint account so that no one of us can get the money without the full awareness and agreement of the other. And the real problem is me. I'm the spender in our family, okay? She's very sort of, a good planner. I'm the one who spends. Secondly, we put another 10% into a retirement account that is a joint account, and we decide together what we're going to do with it, if it's a mortgage or whatever. Third is we have an emergency account that we cannot take money out of unless we're both agreed. The fourth is an investment account. The fifth is a school fees account that we try and keep at least 2 terms ahead so that we never have the stress of looking for school fees. The sixth, is an investment CDS account so that we can buy shares together. And then the 7th is what we call our annuals account. And what I mean by annuals is that this is where we put the money prorated for, each year for the land rent. Land rent in this country for, a property of 1 acre is probably around, maybe about 8,000 shillings. And so if you divide 8 by 12, you take that money and every month you put it into that account. When the land rent is due in February or March next year, the money is sitting there. You just pay it. There's no stress. And so we put in our land rent, our land rates, our Christmas money, our birthday money, and those sorts of things that you pay the bill only once. We have 7 joint accounts and then 3 personal accounts where we put in now our pocket money. Okay, and we have a budget. I get pocket money each month, and my wife gets pocket money. We spend 5,000 shillings on each girl's birthday. 5,000 shillings. That includes a present, a birthday cake, and a birthday party. And we tell our girls, we'll bake a cake, because we bake the cake at home to keep it cheap. We'll bake a cake for you. You have to decide, do you want to have that cake at home with us, or you want to take it to school, or you want to take it to Sunday school? But you only celebrate your birthday once. You don't celebrate your birthday 3 times. You celebrate it once. So decide where you want. If you want to take it to school, then you can take it, and we won't celebrate the birthday at home. If you want to celebrate it at home, then it will stay here. We'll celebrate as a family. 5,000 shillings. So we bake the cake at home, and we invite 3 or 4 of their friends so that we can stay within our budget. And we also draw our own birthday cards. We don't buy them. And then we buy a birthday present for 1,000 or 2,000 shillings. 5,000 shillings. That's how we tame our budget. We separate our accounts so that we don't mix and misuse them. And then we only use banks that don't charge us ledger fees. And when a bank charges us, we close the account and we go and open up somewhere else. We hold all our money in joint accounts so that we both have to agree on how to spend funds. Each of us gets a monthly pocket money expenditure to spend on ourselves. And guys, all this sounds terribly limiting and frugal, but this is how we have created wealth. So you may laugh at me because I eat githeri for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner. Okay? You may laugh at me when I tell you that we only spend 5,000 shillings on each of our girls per birthday. You may laugh at me when I tell you that we both drive a 10-year-old Mitumba car. It's okay because while you laugh at me, I'm laughing all the way to the bank. And I'm creating wealth. And we tithe, and we're generous, and we're paying school fees for needy children, and we're helping the poor, and God is continuing to bless us. If you want to be a good steward of God's money, budget and save. The greatest mistake most people make is to not have a plan, a budget for their spending. Without a plan, you will fail. Money and bills will harass you, and you won't know which way to go except to bury your head in the sand and hope that the troubles pass by. If you have a plan, you can deal with debt, you can project what to focus on, when you'll be done with a bill, how much to spend on something, and how to recover from emergencies. You will not create wealth if you have not planned out the finances that God is putting in your hands from month to month. And remember what we said, when you go to heaven and you ask God, God, every day of my life I prayed that you would bless me with wealth. God will tell you, I did. I gave it to you every month, but you spent it all. You didn't use it wisely. If you get into the habit of living on only 60% of your take-home, you will start accumulating money in the bank, you will start accumulating assets, and you will start creating wealth. Because, my dear friends, money in the bank creates margins, and margins bring peace from the harassment of debt and from the harassment of financial need. But if you're consuming everything that God gives you, you are on the highway to poverty, and it will harass you. You will never create wealth. You see, guys, let me tell you a truth, okay? I could put my third principle this way. It's not how much you're paid that matters. It's how much you save. That's what creates wealth, not how much you're paid. There are people being paid, 700,000 shillings per month in this country, and they are as poor as you. They drive a Range Rover, but it belongs to the bank. They live in Karen, but it belongs to the bank. And if they had an economic downturn and lost their job, you'll be seeing them knocking on the neighboring door looking for a vacant flat for $20,000 because they can't afford the lifestyle they're living. It's not how much you're paid, but how much you save that creates wealth. And so, my friends, this then is the third principle. Right now, my wife and I have been trying to beat down our expenses so that we can go from 60% of our take home and go down to 50%. Have you noticed I'm losing weight? The githeri no longer has any meat in it. I'm now eating calf because we're trying to beat it down to 50% and create a bigger margin to be able to create wealth. This is principle number 3. Would you rise to your feet and let's pray together and close our service. Father, we want to thank you for these things that the scriptures teach us. And even this lesson in Luke chapter 14, that it is foolishness for us to enter into any project that demands resources, and we have not sat down and budgeted first to see whether we can accomplish what we set out to do. And unfortunately, for many of us, Lord, this is exactly where we are. We've never put together a budget. We don't know how we're spending. We just spend as the money is there. And we're harassed by debt and harassed by our financial problems. And so we pray, having heard you, that we would go home and do what is needful. Give us the courage to move house if that's what we need to do, to sell our car and pay debts with that, to put the children in cheaper schools, to eat a simpler diet. Help us to have the courage to turn these things that we have heard into reality. That a year down the road, the pressure of finances would have dissipated, would have created margins, financial margins in our lives, and peace would have become a companion to us in our homes. Help us, Lord. We're given to bad habits. We spend wantonly. We don't always think about our purchases. We don't go for what is inexpensive. We don't shop around to find out where we can find cheaper goods. Help us, Lord. And give us a windfall. Give us a blessing. Lord, please help us to get ahead so that we don't have to live with the pressure that we feel presently. Enable us to create wealth and to be good stewards of these truths that we're learning. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you.